And what's the last bit? We will head back to the... So, we've had a few people offer up. Councillor Darby has offered to come off the reference group. If Councillor Bartley can't make it, he will come in. Councillor Dalton is going to do CCO Oversight Committee, and Bill Cashmore will be the alternate. I will be there in place of the chair of the Environment and Climate Change Committee, and Pippa will come as an alternate if I cannot make it. And the same with the Independent Māori Statutory Board. It'll be the chair or deputy chair. So that narrows down the numbers, but then we also have added at the bottom, including regular reporting to this committee. So there will be more extensive coming back to the full committee, and I hope that is trying to cover the situation that we've been dealing with throughout the committee. Thank you. Now I'm going to...
Mr. Chair, just a seconder.
Yes.
The word alternate is missing in little 3. This needs to be there to say that it's the deputy chair or the alternate chair. No, but the chair wants to be the alternate for that.
If Angela cannot make it, then Deputy Mayor will come. So we've finished questions, so we're going to go straight to... Yes, Councillor. I'm sure that would be fine. Yeah. Cool. And we'll get back to you on that. So, sorry about that. So we have 5 speakers so far. Councillor Watson speaking turn.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess it's been an interesting convergence this week of climate-related announcements or initiatives, hasn't it? I mean, if we start with the latest intergovernmental panel on climate change right at the start of the week, we're told scientists are observing changes in the Earth's climate in every region and across the whole climate system. Many of the changes observed in the climate are unprecedented in thousands of years. Some of the changes already set in motion, such as sea level rise, are irreversible over hundreds of thousands of years. The report provides new estimates of the chances of crossing the global warming level of 1.5 degrees Celsius in the next decades, and finds that unless there are immediate, rapid and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to close to 1.5 or even 2 degrees Celsius will be beyond reach. And remember, at 2 degrees Celsius, heat extremes would have often reached critical tolerance thresholds for agriculture and health, the report shows. And that came out on August 9th. Coincidentally, during the week, I saw news items from Greece where children's play equipment was melting in the sun. So if you think of those little parks that are dotted around Auckland, if you think of the slides and the seats melting, that was what was happening in Greece. One of the other convergence items was the release of vehicle sale data for New Zealand, and that broadly showed that New Zealanders are now driving bigger cars, travelling greater distances and emitting more carbon dioxide as they go. The top 4 most popular new passenger cars last year were all SUVs. Even the poor old Toyota Corolla lost its #1 spot it held for many years. 55% of all vehicle sales were SUVs, and of course SUVs typically emit more than about 10 to 15% in terms of emissions and equivalent passengers. That was the second piece of news that I came across. And I guess the third piece of news is our item here today, the proposed approach and government structure for the Transport Emissions Reduction Plan. And I guess when I put them all together, I just wonder how fast or meaningful is the response that is emerging, given that, without perhaps being too cynical on things, this kind of process seems to be a rerun of any number we've had already. And I think the report is a good one, but I think point 70 signals certainly some of the concerns that I've got, and that in terms of any interventions being implemented in a meaningful way. So they talked about the constraints of slow decision-making processes. I think we could all recognise that. Mixed signals from central government, particularly in respect of the approach to urban growth. And I would combine with that maybe no signals in terms of often response at a community level, and the lack of community mandate for certain solutions, because that's pretty clear the communications with the community are scarce or lacking at the least. And if we take on board probably one of the more telling statements in the report, that reducing the amount people drive is critical to reducing transport emissions, and that Auckland has a disproportionate part to play in the New Zealand picture, then we really have a job to do with actually getting people on board. And someone mentioned in the presentation how this change facing us was probably the biggest since the Second World War. I think it probably could go back a few millennia before that, to be honest. But if we take that Second World War as an appropriate analogy, I would suggest we perhaps need the same sort of command structure that existed in the war, because the rather sort of lengthy bureaucratic response doesn't seem to have really produced too much meaningful thus far, even to a population or the parts of the population that are receptive to actually doing things now. And there's any number of things that could be happening right at the moment to reduce those kilometres per individual or per vehicle travelled. They haven't started. What is the lead into the change, to the dramatic change we talked about? Well, there is none. There is no real kind of plea going out to people who are sympathetic to be doing any number of initiatives now that aren't high cost, that make use of the existing infrastructure, and that begin that step process to the greater change we've talked about before. I would suggest that is a very big failing in both the local and the central government in particular. They are the ones who are leading out in this, but also us in terms of picking that up in our messaging, as we call it. So, Mr. Chair, I heard the little bell go. I would suggest that bell is ticking for all of us in a far more potentially devastating way than the 5 minutes at the Auckland City Council.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Councillor Philippine.
Thank you, Chair. Look, item 13 on our agenda is why we're here, and that's the report seeks delegated authority for the establishment of what you've now done in D. So that's all I'm going to talk about, because we know how important this is. I do, however, Your Worship, I took exception to some of the comments you made, and it's important for me to air those exceptions so then I can be very clear around why. And that is, Your Worship, the questions that, at least I can only speak for myself, the questions I asked around our community is why we are here around this delegated authority, Your Worship. And then when I heard you say that, the questions around the numbers, we need to stay away because these are important. This is why we've got this agenda item on here. And I thought that my questioning from your perspective was too much in the detail when we've got a very important job to do. So from my perspective, this is why I asked the questions, because I know, and the responses I got, was that community engagement is so important, whether it be with our Pacific community, as Councillor Collins pointed out, whether it be with around our four well-beings, whether it be with all our communities across Tamaki Makaurau. So if I got it misinterpreted what you said, Your Worship, my apologies, but that's how I heard it. Because that's all my questioning was around, is because we're here to approve really the delegated authority to the establishment of the Transport Emissions Reference Group. That's all my questions were there. In regards to this reference group, Chair, I just want to say that the changes you have made is exactly what I think should have been done. And just to let everybody know, and I spoke to Councillor Casey, the Deputy Chair of our Parks, Arts, Community and Events Committee, we did not want to go in here on this particular reference group. What the point I wanted to make is that everything around our committee is around community. You know, and that applies to all the committees across Tāmaki. So my point was saying that we just, please do not forget our communities, do not forget our Pacific people, especially in light of the effects that their families, the Ainga, have in their respective islands. So, Chair, fully support this, fully support the changes that you have made, and I look forward to all the updates that will come through to this committee and with workshops. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Councillor, thank you. Councillor Dalton coming through on Skype.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sorry I couldn't be there. Look, my comments are simply related to the recommendations of the item and not the broader issues around the impacts of climate change. In addition to the diversity issues that have been raised by the other speakers, I think what is really important for the strategic part of this particular process is that the reference group from the governing body side has a political balance. So there is some assurance around the table that there can be some disruptive thinking and alternative contributions from different worldviews. That can be achieved through a committee scenario, but I can't even imagine where we would find the hours to do that given the time allocated so far today deciding on the participants to a reference group. So I'll be supporting your new recommendations here today. I'd also like consideration to be given to resourcing this work. It is a priority in the long-term plan, and I'd like to see a submission to the annual plan for additional resourcing. I'd be happy to sponsor that advocacy. So just to sum up, I'd like to thank everyone that presented this item today, some really interesting conversations. I'm excited to have the opportunity to be on the reference group because we are over the tipping point in addressing these issues around climate change. And I look forward to ensuring that all of my colleagues are kept up to date and informed as we progress through. So thank you, Chair, for this opportunity.
Kia ora, Councillor, thank you. Councillor Henderson.
Thanks, Chair. Two quick points. I mean, firstly, perhaps I wasn't clear in bringing up the makeup of the committee, even though that's what we're debating. I agree with the Mayor. The issues here are so huge. Like I've said in my question, this is maybe one of the biggest things that we will ever discuss as a council. And so my point really was that this is the committee, in my view. All of us need to input that. I'm going to vote for it today because I think it has improved being a little bit smaller and with a little bit more flexible. But I want regular reporting and regular work through this. It's more important than most of the stuff we talk about, frankly. I'm not saying break it down ward by ward. But also as part of that, I'd like to see representation from the Youth Advisory Panel and the Pacific Panel as well as part of those wider workshops that we have together. because they have huge, they're fantastic, by the way, and they've got huge things to contribute. But the second point I wanted to raise was around my questioning around communications. I won't go there on innovating streets, but I think I could probably write a book on that now. I think it'd be a good book. Maybe I should do it one day. But yeah, we have the majority of people demanding action, but there are communities out there that just haven't considered things like this. And we forget those communities, frankly, working class communities that are just out there trying to put food on the table, right? The fact is, poorer communities in Auckland cannot afford to care about climate change. That's the reality. And yet we are faced with drastic decisions that we have to do that will disrupt people's lives. And we need to make a serious attempt at actually bringing those people along with us. You know, we've heard voices from communities saying, why don't you do something about climate change in the abstract? We don't hear enough from individual communities saying, my neighbourhood could use this, my neighbourhood could use that, because we want to do our bit for climate change. We don't hear that. You know, I had protests on the streets of my ward around this on a project that would have actually really helped climate change emissions and climate change mitigation. We can't sit here and say that the community are with us on this point. Not a lot of communities out there anyway. And, you know, it's our democratic duty that at the end of the day, we can only go as far as the public actually let us go. So we've got a big challenge between what we actually need to do and what the public will let us do. And as the Mayor has said, and I really love this quote and I say it all the time, that we govern by consent every day, not just at the ballot box. And so I would remind the committee of this point, and I think that's sort of what we should be doing, working really hard at their communications, bringing poorer communities along and empowering and enabling them. Yeah, that's all I've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Henderson. Councillor Walker.
I've had a chance to read the report. The concern that I have on an ongoing basis is the necessity for scenarios, because that is the only way to break through the impasse that we have in respect of advice from officers and in respect of our own decisions. We're increasingly locked into, for example, a long-term plan. We don't consider any alternative pathways is the word that's used here, but there's nothing, in fact, pathway is singular in this. So I have a real concern that, again, we're just looking at one track. There will probably be budgetary considerations and the like. You know, often when we have meetings, increasingly, people thump their hands on the table and they talk about limiting what we're doing because of budgets and the like. That is not the approach that we can take. It is not the approach that we can take. So we need a scenario-based approach. We need to embrace the changes that means around finance. We need to have far better integration from people from outside who I would suggest have significantly more to contribute than what we may even have within our organisation. We also need to build relationships with other cities that are way ahead of us. So we should be relooking at our membership of ICLEI, for example, and the opportunity for councillors to engage in webinars, and let's have an eco-mobility trial. I've been to a couple of those. Let's engage with our communities and local boards, not have the largely introverted approach that we're increasingly having that's driven by finance. Let's look at our decisions on an ongoing basis. We made a decision the other day not to have a marina strategy when the marinas are going to be the lifelines for transport within Auckland, with the emergence of the need to adapt around climate change and mitigate. Yet we made a bad decision then. That was only just a few days ago. So on a decision-by-decision basis, the body of people around this room continue not to make the right decisions. When we're actually capable of that, and when we're actually getting advice from the community, that's at odds with that. That raises issues around climate change if we want to listen to it. It's really important around this issue that we take on the government. We haven't been very good at that. So quite clearly, right now, we need electricity reforms, and those reforms need to go to Auckland. Otherwise, everything that we're talking about that goes to electrifying the fleet is frankly redundant. Are we taking that on? Does this council have any energy strategy? No, we don't. Have we even considered it? No, we haven't. Should we? Well, arguably yes, because energy constitutes a very significant part of our emissions. But again, we're silent on things like that, largely I'd suggest because we've got a reluctance to provide the leadership in Auckland that we need to, and to challenge the government. And right now, as it stands, our biggest challenge is the takeover by government in terms of planning, in terms of transport, in terms of water and sewage and stormwater, in fact, almost everything. So if we are going to stand up around climate change and what we can do in Auckland, then we need to be much more vocal for Auckland than what we are right now, because we are essentially silent. So I'm just putting some hard things on the table. It's been 10 years now since I led out the first climate change strategy for Auckland, where we actually had some roadmaps identified, and those roadmaps were never developed, they were actually discarded. So we've lost 10 years now, which is incredibly disturbing. So I'm certainly interested in engaging this process as one councillor, and I would hope that others are, because I've certainly taken an interest in this on an ongoing basis, Mr. Chair, and I'm incredibly disturbed at the situation that we're in 10 years after the beginning of this council under the leadership of the then Mayor, Len Brown, where we were making, I think, significantly more progress than what we're making now. Thank you.
Kia ora, thank you, Councillor Walker. Mayor Goff.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Look, we're making this decision, interestingly, in the very week that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out. And anyone that read and went through that report that wasn't incredibly distressed by what it means for humankind needs to think again. We are faced with a disaster. We're seeing those disasters right now. The wildfires, the droughts, the flooding, the sea level rises. You know, Trump was a dinosaur. The days of leaders that say that there is no such thing as climate change, I hope, are well and truly past. But the fact is that time is not just running out. The time for climate change action is not tomorrow. It has to be today. And this is a further wake-up call. And I think the public understands that, though the public may not understand the costs that will be imposed by dealing effectively with it. So when we looked at what we can do in Auckland, the thing that stood out was transport, because it's 39%, close to 40% of our global emissions, our carbon emissions. And to reduce that by 64% is huge. That means that we have to transform the whole way in which transport works in our city. It can't be more motorways, more sprawling city, and ongoing use of internal combustion engines. Those changes have got to be made. It's no good us just saying we're going to reduce it by 64%. We have to have a plan about how we're going to reduce it. And that's what the work of officers are going to be on this committee. And we need to know what the cost of that is. And I just, again, draw your attention, Mr. Chair, to the fact that we haven't talked about cost, but I am simply assuming that cost will be part of the report back to us. Because if we don't have the costs, we're kind of dealing with the theoretical. Once we've got the costs, we know, okay, that's what we have to do. Now, how can we do it? In terms of the committee, Councillor Filipaina, I wasn't getting at your comments. I was basically saying, you know, there are 3 or 4 different committee chairs and vice chairs we could have put on that, but we would end up with a committee the same size as this grouping. And what we needed, this working group is not going to be the group that makes the decisions. This is so important that officers are going to have to come back to us again and again in workshops to have the discussions. All of us. None of us want to be left out of this, so I take your point. What we will always also be doing is that we'll be making the hard decisions in this committee and in finance and performance. When we make those hard decisions, we need to have clear explanations about what we're doing, how we've prioritised it, and how we're going to pay for it. And we need to have a breakdown between what we pay for and what government pays for. Now, I'm conscious of the fact that government takes the vast majority of public revenue in this country, and they'll be leading it. And their emissions reduction plan in December is going to have a really big influence on what we're doing. But can we say, well, no, it's all government and we don't have a role to play? Of course we can't. We do have a role to play. We will play that role, and we will work in partnership, not only with government, but also with interest groups, with businesses, with community groups and members of the public. We're all in this together. You know, the sea level rise is going to affect every waka. No, there is no escaping this, and there is no escaping the cost. You know, I wince when I think of the cost of it, so does the chair of the Finance Committee, but we will meet that cost anyway. The question is, do we meet the cost after the disasters have befallen us, or do we meet that cost before and try to preempt the disasters? But make no mistake, somewhere along the line, we as taxpayers and ratepayers are going to have to pay for the actions to stop the rise in carbon emissions from our country, which is one of the highest in the world per capita in the industrial world. So we have to take it on. We have to be part of it. This is a plan that takes us in the right direction, but the decisions that will be made won't simply be made by the Transport Emissions Reference Group. They are simply adding regular guidance to the officers, but we will have those discussions back here in workshops, and we'll have to make decisions that will probably be the most important decisions we will make in our time on this council.
Thank you, Mayor Goff. Councillor Young. Oh no, sorry, Councillor Darby.
Thanks, Chair. Look, thanks to the staff, the board directors, Deputy Chair Wayne McDonald and Director Abby Reynolds and Greg Nelson, Jacques Victor, you Chair, for bringing this up. This is the product that came out of the regional land transport decisions. We recognised then that we're coming up way short and we needed to do something dramatic and do it soon. So it's good to see this step taken. We've spent a long time discussing a pretty simple structure, really. And the real contest is going to be when we get into the thick of it, when this Transport Emissions Reduction Plan Reference Group comes back to us. Chair, I signalled that I'd come off this trying to break down the footy team plus very hefty reserve bench down to something that maybe would resemble a netball team. We're getting there, but I'm sure I'll be part of it, and those that have stepped aside will continue to be part of it. But, you know, we need to be a bit more nimble in the way we do these things. I can't help also, and I do thank Chris Thurston from Watercare, and I love on one of his slides the line, act on climate like a proud ancestor. Act on climate like a proud ancestor. And I'm sure Mana Whenua can identify with a line like that. And I do too, and the key word is act. It's a very, very powerful message, and it's a really powerful message for all of us in governance. And while it's going to take all of society to respond, we're the ones in the dock on this, and we won't be leaving the dock on this for a very long time. In fact, I think our communities are starting to see us as being guilty until proving our innocence on climate change. Right now, I think we're in the guilty category. And in some ways, we're deserving to be in the dock. So that goes for all elected members, whether you're mayor, councillor, local board member, whether you're an MP, a cabinet minister or a prime minister, we are all in that category at the moment. There is high expectation placed on us to make sure that we move past, I think we have moved past climate denial into and past climate delay and the pretense of action and so-called incremental action and looking good action to real, demonstrating very real and meaningful action. That's where we need to start being every day. And as others have outlined, the scale of the response is going to have to be immense. It's going to have to be very dramatic. It is not going to look remotely like living as we know it in present day. But that doesn't mean to say it's not going to come with, as Abby Reynolds said, some beauty and some opportunity. There's going to be some nuggets in this as well. But there's no denying that we cannot be head in the sand and thinking the Athenian fires just belong in Europe, or the burning of Siberia as it is at the moment just belongs somewhere else, or the floods in Germany, they're just another European thing. This is at our gate as well, and it's sadly, it's just a matter of time before we have such a catastrophe here on that unimaginable scale. The point I would like to make today, Chair, is yes, the burden could be immense, but the opportunity could be phenomenal. The costs might be high, but the costs of inaction will be incomparable with the cost of actually paying our way to get there at the moment. And I guess one thing that really worries me is just where the leaders are in their action. So when we start to, in the months ahead of next year, ask Aucklanders to consider dramatic changes in how they move about the city, they are going to be pointing to us and they're going to say, what was your change? Leader, what was your change? And we can't be at risk of being called out as the laggard leaders at that point. So we are going to have to change our behaviours ahead of asking Aucklanders to change their behaviours. Otherwise, this is all hollow man direction setting. And so I'm going to be changing even more so my personal travel behaviours because this is an immense issue that is not going to go away for a long time, and we're going to have to show our change and our behaviour all around this table, around local boards, around cabinet tables. All of the political leaders are going to have to show at the outset that we are doing things differently.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Collins.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to touch on point 70 of the report as well. And in coming to that, in fact, I really enjoyed what you had to say, Councillor Henderson.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed that. It was just around the lack of community mandate for certain solutions. I like the approach, avoid, shift, improve. This is awesome. I really liked. I liked reading the report. It gave me a sense of ambition, a desire for change to be made, and I think that's a really good place for us to be. The committee was it was pretty large last time, and now we're down to 9. I can see. I hope that it stays. Is it 9? Hey, that's really good. I hope it does better than the NRL 9s that we lost and went back to Australia. So let's make sure we maintain that impetus. I'm going to keep trying with my sporting analogies. I think the key for me is shifting it from the public policy, public discourse discussion to public reality. And the reality is, for my community, is that these shifts are really hard. It's hard to go from avoid to shift to improve when you're really dependent, when you don't have a lot of money. The report that came out from the Ministry of Transport around equity, was equity in Auckland's transport, showed this. The number one finding was that low income is the most consistent factor affecting people's ability to afford transport to meet their needs. And their key recommendation out of that report was this, that equity should be far more explicit in transport policy. And that's my encouragement to this group of people, to ensure that equity is at the core of our considerations. And that's what I mean by taking it from that public policy discussion to the public reality, because it is really tough on many in our communities to make that shift. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the comms. I think we've got to get the comms right, both in who we engage with and who's championing these messages. And look, Councillor Henderson touched on innovating streets. There was an attempt just a couple of months ago to innovate the bridge. Hey, and if we think about it, now I don't want to get into the pros and cons of that attempt, but that's part of the community saying, well, we didn't have a mandate, so we went out. My particular interest was how it was handled by the police, but the fact is there are drivers in the community that want to see this change, but we've got to get the balance right, and that's what I mean about the comms, is that I think sometimes in Auckland we operate on such extreme spectrums where you've got people who just say, nah, not prepared to go with that, and those who are saying, let's change everything, and we've got to get the balance right. So I'm asking this committee to think carefully about the comms, carefully about, the changes that we're making. I caught the train to the office today and had a great discussion with former Mayor Len Brown, who was also on the train and sat next to me. But those are some of the steps that we can take, but who's going to lead this stuff out there? Because otherwise we're always going to be operating in our sections of the world, and regardless of the reports that we're reading that are saying to us we need to act with urgency, that public discourse means nothing if the public reality seems so far away from that. So we've got to make the connections better. Otherwise, it's just another report that says, yep, act with urgency, but I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do and how I'm going to get help along the way to make the changes that are necessary so that we have a planet to live on. Thanks.
Kia ora. Deputy Chair Pipakun.
Kia ora, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the opportunity. I would like to speak in support, and in doing so, it is very difficult not to think of the context of the IPCC report and how depressing that report is in terms of the grim predictions and the real dire picture that it paints. It's very frightening and sobering. And just the fact that we have such a small window if we're going to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that window is rapidly shrinking. So this piece of work in terms of the pathway is going to have to do all of the heavy lifting, and I think that's why it's so significant and why I think we've had some really good contributions today, and I do thank the whole team for bringing this to us, because this bit of work is going to influence everything that we are doing around transport. So it is in terms of setting this up and having a reference group that will be bringing back the pathways in the TERP. That's especially for you, Councillor Casey. You love a good acronym.
TERP, not TERP.
The TERP. The TERP. So the TERP will be doing all of that heavy lifting if we're going to achieve our 64% reduction. And I'm going to channel, it was great having the board directors, Wayne and Abby, along, and I'm going to channel all that positivity from Abby, because it is, when you look at that, the picture from the IPCC report being so depressing, but actually it is what Abby said, looking at that beautiful picture, beautiful future, and really how compelling it is that if we act, if we get this pathway right, and the report does mention this in paragraph 6, particularly how the benefits of decarbonising the transport system, particularly around addressing inequalities. And we are very good at forgetting that the current transport system is deeply inequitable. So this piece of work and the pathways that we're going to be developing have this great opportunity for cleaner air, fewer deaths and serious injuries, improved public health, lower infrastructure costs, and more equitable access to jobs, schools, health services, recreation, and other opportunities. And I have just read that from the report because it's such a good summary about the benefits that we can be looking towards. In terms of the reference group, I did just want to say, it's a shame Councillor Alf has just left the room, because I wanted to just say to him that when I think about the makeup, it isn't, skills was the wrong word. I mean, we just all have to have our regional councillor hat on and coming to this reference group, and that none of us around this table have got skills specifically around climate change or sustainability, but what we can bring to it is some enthusiasm to work on this. And so everybody who wants to be involved, I think, should be invited into it. And of course, Councillor Walker, I know you've had a long background and some skills. So I'm just think it's all hands to the pump, and whoever wants to be involved in this work should come along and get involved. So I don't think we have to get ourselves too worked up about the makeup or how many people are in the room, because it's just going to boil down to who are the keen beans who really want to get stuck in. And as has been said, it will be coming back to the decision making of this committee. Just wanted to highlight one thing in terms of one of the comments. One of the contributors to the IPCC report said that one of the main takeaways was that the Earth's climate systems was responding faster than the politicians. And I think we end up hearing that a lot around this table, that we all recognise the emergency, but then we get really bogged down in the weeds. And one of those big challenges that I acknowledge my colleagues have said is around that consultation and how we're bringing the community along. But I do think about this in terms of the COVID challenge. And in February last year, we didn't have time to start consulting with the community and bringing everybody along. When we went into lockdown, we had to act. And I think we've all got to prepare ourselves for the fact that a lot of these pathways are going to be things that we're just going to have to act on really, really fast. There's not going to be an opportunity for rounds and rounds of consultation. But we can take a lot from the fact that Te Taurukia Tawhiri had one of the highest levels of engagement ever, particularly from rangatahi, young people's voices, from a real broad range of the community came and gave us really strong support for having a plan for Auckland. So we know we have that mandate. We know we have to act. I know it can be hard when there's a lot of community hating on paint on the ground, but in Henderson, but that is just going to be small fry when it comes to the really big issues and the really big actions that we're going to have to implement and will be coming out of this pathway. So thank you for the opportunity to be part of this work and for all of those who've brought it to us. And thank you, Mr. Chair. I am very supportive. Ngā mihi.
Kia ora, Deputy Chair. Thank you, first of all, to Shening and Robert and Jacques and Jenny and Greg and Auckland Transport Board members, everyone who's been involved in this process. And I feel good about the relationship working together. It's much like the built relationship on the drought with water care. I think, unfortunately, sometimes the big scary things fortunately bring us together, and I've enjoyed seeing that, and I'm sure it will happen ongoing. Thank you everyone around the committee for supporting and all the questions, comments and interest in this subject. I think it is difficult. I said to Alex Crosby, who's left council now but was a councillor support advisor when I first became the chair of this committee, that I was never going to talk about climate disasters and storms and natural disasters because it scares everyone off and it doesn't actually achieve anything. That was late 2019. Then we had, soon after that, fires in Australia, which turned our skies red. We then had the drought begin, Auckland's worst ever drought, which we're still currently in. Then we had a pandemic, which many scientists are saying was driven by climate because we're cutting down forests and places where animals live, and those animals are now coming into communities and villages and spreading what usually is diseases that only spread to other animals. So we've got that situation coming on. Then we had a 1 in 500 year flood up in Whangarei that's caused significant damage, and that council has had to deal with upgrading and changing things pretty quickly. We've had, this year, we've had a 1 in 1,000 year flood in China. We've had floods in Berlin and parts of Germany that have never, ever, ever flooded. We've got settlements that were there well before the world wars that weren't lost in world wars that are now completely ruined. We've got fires in Greece right now. 200,000 hectares of forest has been burnt. I was watching a news story with a farmer talking about how he believes his crops and where the whole town gets its food from will not recover for maybe 30 to 40 years, if that. There are situations happening in New Zealand, Westport. We've had significant flooding all happen in 1 week on different coasts of our country. And I guess when we talk about cost, the cost of those things are far greater than anything we might need to spend now on climate and preventing these things from happening. We spent 10 million out of nowhere for the Newland floods. We then, with the drought, had to spend 224 million almost overnight during a pandemic to address our drought issues. I remember during the Tasman tempest, Watercare had to spend a ton of money because we suddenly had clay in our water supply because the forests, the pine forests there were washed out. We had 150 slips on public land that time that we're still fixing now 4 or 5 years later. The cost of not doing anything is far greater than the cost of acting. And what I see this pathway plan that all of us will be involved in is actually trying to figure out how we do what we've said we're going to do and what we know we have to do. With the IPCC report, they've stopped saying 94% of scientists, they're just saying it's unequivocal. This is humans that are creating this problem and humans that are dealing with this problem. And unfortunately, it's our most vulnerable communities dealing with the heat, dealing with the difficulties of the coldest nights and the hottest nights without the housing and heating or air conditioning to support them. It's our more vulnerable communities who aren't having the access to the transport that we should be providing them. I have a bus that comes past my driveway every morning, every 10 minutes, and I get that bus because it's easy and it's frequent and there's a transit lane. There are communities, as Shane, Efeso, Alf, many others around this table do not have that opportunity. All we're saying is that we need to dramatically increase opportunities for our communities to have access to what I have access to and what other people have access to. It's not about forcing people out of their cars, because I believe in the next couple of years, and we've seen it since COVID, that we've started to recover, petrol prices have gone up 30 cents a litre in that short amount of time. Can you imagine what it's going to be like in 6 years, 8 years, 10 years? UK and Europe and other, there's some countries in Asia who are banning fossil fuel vehicles by 2030. So people are not going to make those cars, especially for us. So if we don't plan for electric vehicles, if we don't plan for walking, cycling, public transport, we're actually not going to have anything for our people to drive because actually there'll be no manufacturing of those products, especially of big markets like the UK and the European Union are not accepting those vehicles. So I guess what I'm saying is that we keep saying we need to bring the community along with us, and I know we will. But we also had the highest numbers of Māori, Pacifica and young people submit to Te Tarakia Tawhiti than we've had on any other plan that we've ever had, saying that we need to act. We've had the highest support for an item on a 10-year budget that I can think of was the water quality targeted rates, the natural environment targeted rates, and now the $152 million extra for climate initiatives. Those were all way up there compared to anything I've seen in a 10-year budget. So people want us to act, and I guess it's now time to act. We're not going to do this alone, but we actually kind of have to get ahead of it and show people what it looks like. Because at the moment we keep blaming everyone. I know we got angry at Auckland Transport. We had all these ideas, but actually we haven't shown people what it looks like. It probably will be unpalatable. It might be impossible. But if we don't start by showing people those pathways and showing people what needs to change, then actually we'll get nowhere. And we won't reduce anything, and we won't improve our water quality, air quality, heat, etc., etc. So I guess this is a small part of the bigger part of what we need to do. Thank you all for being a part of it, and we'll try and save the world. But we at least need to do this for Tāmaki Makaurau and future generations. So thank you. All those in favour? Anybody opposed? No? Can I say that was passed unanimously? Thank you very much. Now, the sad thing is, because I didn't plan on going this long, there is no lunch waiting for anyone, so we will go on to item 10 and try and get through this quite quickly, another important piece of the puzzle.
presentation.